Welcome to The Real Voices, where every moment is inspired by truth. Some stories heal, some haunt, and some remind us what it means to be human. Tell us where you're listening from. Your voice matters here. And let us know how we can make every story feel more real, more alive, and closer to your heart. Now, settle in, take a deep breath, and let the story unfold. The mother-in-law who loved her daughter's husband. The evening light fell gently upon Ashworth House, tinting its ivy-covered walls a soft gold. From the open windows drifted the scent of freshly baked pudding and the faint hum of laughter. Inside, the great drawing room was alive with the comfortable chatter of a family that seemed, to all eyes, content. At the center of the room sat Marianne Hale, graceful even in her simplicity. Her silvery hair was neatly tied, and her calm blue eyes surveyed the family table with quiet satisfaction. The delicate china cups gleamed under the amber glow of the lamps, and the fire crackled in the hearth with a domestic warmth that made the evening almost idyllic. "Richard, my dear," she said softly, "do try the pudding. It's a family recipe. Patrick says it's too sweet, but then he says that about everything pleasant." Her son-in-law smiled as he leaned forward, spooning a portion from the dish. Richard Hale was a man in his early 30s, confident, handsome in that easy, effortless way that made people forgive his charm even when they should not. He wore a crisp white shirt rolled at the sleeves, revealing forearms lightly dusted with flour from the kitchen where he had helped Marianne only minutes earlier. "It's perfect," he said after a bite. "Truly, Mother, no one in the county could rival you in the kitchen." Marianne's lips curved, a quiet, reluctant smile. "Flattery doesn't suit you, Richard." "But honesty does," he replied, his eyes meeting hers for a second too long. The sound of a teacup clinking sharply against its saucer broke the moment. Alice, Marianne's daughter, looked up. Her expression caught somewhere between amusement and irritation. "Mother, you'll have him utterly spoiled. He already insists on your cooking more than mine." Patrick Whitmore, Marianne's husband, tall, severe, and old-fashioned to the bone, let out a low chuckle. "That's the trouble with you young men. You've married wives who want to dine like ladies, not cook like them." The laughter that followed was easy, but Marianne's gaze lingered on Richard. She could still feel the warmth of his hand brushing hers as they had reached for the sugar bowl earlier. It had been nothing, accidental surely, yet something inside her chest had stirred in a way she hadn't felt in years. Patrick, she thought, hadn't looked at her that way in decades. When tea was finished, the family began to drift, Alice to her embroidery, Patrick to his study with the evening newspaper, and Richard to the piano near the window. The soft tune of a waltz filled the air, light and careless. Marianne paused by the mantelpiece, pretending to rearrange the flowers in the vase. "You play well?" she said quietly. Richard looked up from the keys, smiling. "You always say that." "Because it's true," she replied, her tone gentler than she intended. He stood, approaching her with an easy confidence that made her suddenly aware of how close he was. "I think what you really mean," he said, lowering his voice, "is that you enjoy listening." Marianne's cheeks colored faintly. "I'm sure your wife does too." "Perhaps," he murmured, "but not quite like you." She turned away, pretending to fix a crooked picture frame, but her hand trembled. It was absurd, shameful even, that a simple compliment could awaken something she thought had long died within her. At 51, she had resigned herself to a quiet life, a life of tending gardens, hosting dinners, and watching the seasons roll through Ashworth House like clockwork. Yet this young man, with his careless grin and unguarded admiration, had begun to tilt her world in the smallest, most dangerous ways. "Marianne," Patrick called from the study, his voice brisk. "Have you seen my spectacles?" She startled, her composure snapping back like a mask. "On the side table, dear," she replied, and hurried from the room, grateful for the interruption. Richard watched her go, the sway of her skirt, the quickness of her steps. A smile ghosted across his lips. He hadn't meant for their friendship to become anything unusual, but there was something about Marianne that intrigued him. She was not beautiful in the way young women were, not like Alice with her golden curls and laughter. Marianne possessed something rarer, grace, intelligence, and a quiet dignity that made her every word linger in the mind. And beneath that composure, he sensed something deeper: loneliness. Later that evening, the servants cleared the dining table and the house grew still. Rain tapped softly on the tall windows. Marianne, unable to sleep, wandered to the kitchen to fetch herself a glass of water. To her surprise, the light was already on. Richard stood by the stove, sleeves rolled, pouring tea into a cup. "Oh," he said, with an easy grin, "caught me red-handed. I was hoping for one last cup before bed." "You'll ruin your sleep," she chided gently. "Then I'll blame you," he replied, pouring another cup. "Come, join me. It seems unfair to drink alone." She hesitated, then stepped forward. The air between them seemed warmer than it should have been. They sat at the small kitchen table, the ticking of the clock the only sound between them. For a while they talked. Harmless things, about the rain, about village gossip, about nothing at all. But under the surface, something was shifting. When Richard reached across the table to take the teapot, his hand brushed hers again, this time deliberate, lingering. Marianne drew in a quiet breath. "You shouldn't," she whispered. "Shouldn't what?" he asked softly. "Play with fire," she said, her voice trembling. He smiled faintly. "Then perhaps you shouldn't look at me that way." Her eyes met his, and in that suspended moment, both knew that a line had been crossed, though neither spoke it aloud. Then from somewhere down the corridor, a floorboard creaked. Marianne pulled back instantly, rising from the chair. "Go," she whispered urgently. "If Patrick finds you here—" He stood too, his voice calm. "Then I'll say we were talking about tomorrow's errands." "Please, Richard, just go." He lingered a second longer, then nodded, setting down his cup. "Good night, Marianne." When he left, the silence of the kitchen seemed louder than before. The rain outside had turned heavier, blurring the lantern light beyond the window pane. Marianne sank into the chair, pressing her trembling hands together. She should have felt disgusted, ashamed, but instead there was a strange, burning thrill in her chest. For the first time in years, someone had looked at her not as a wife, nor as a mother, but as a woman. And though she did not yet know it, that single glance across the teacups would set in motion a tragedy that would consume them all. The following days at Ashworth House passed with deceptive calm. From the outside, everything seemed as proper as ever, the gardener trimming roses, the maid dusting the drawing room, and Marianne Hale maintaining her graceful composure. Yet beneath that surface, something fragile and forbidden had begun to stir. Marianne told herself that what happened that night, that fleeting warmth in the kitchen, that stolen glance, had been nothing. A foolish lapse of judgment, best forgotten. And yet, every time Richard entered a room, her pulse betrayed her resolve. The memory of his hand brushing hers haunted her like a soft echo. One afternoon, as the rain gave way to a pale sun, Marianne found herself alone in the parlour, arranging flowers. The window stood open, letting in the scent of wet earth. She was lost in thought when a voice behind her said quietly, "Roses again. You've quite an affection for them." She turned to see Richard Hale standing in the doorway, his jacket unbuttoned, his expression unreadable. "They remind me that beauty fades quickly," she replied, placing another bloom into the vase. "One must enjoy it before it wilts, for it—" He smiled faintly. "A rather tragic philosophy, don't you think?" "Reality often is," she said, her voice steady though her heart was not. He stepped closer, leaning casually against the sideboard. "And yet you still fill the house with them. Perhaps you don't mind a little tragedy?" Marianne looked up sharply, but his tone was light, teasing. Still, she could not ignore the tremor that passed through her. She reached for the vase, nearly upsetting it. Water spilled across the tablecloth, and Richard moved quickly to help, his fingers brushing hers as they caught the falling stem. Their eyes met, only for a moment. But in that moment, silence spoke louder than words. He was the first to pull away, stepping back with a quiet laugh. "Careful, Marianne. You'll drown the roses." "Perhaps they prefer drowning," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. That evening, dinner felt unusually strained. Alice chattered about preparations for the upcoming church fete, unaware of the currents running beneath the table. Patrick Whitmore, as always, was preoccupied with business and the local council. Only Bert, the old house hand, seemed to sense something amiss. His small eyes darted between Marianne and Richard with suspicion sharpened by years of domestic observation. When dinner ended, Patrick excused himself early. "Too many papers to read," he muttered, taking his cigar to the study. Alice followed soon after, humming as she went upstairs. That left Marianne and Richard by the fireplace, the last of the embers glowing faintly. She reached for her knitting basket. Her hands needed something to do. "You'll catch a chill if you sit there much longer," she said, not looking at him. Richard smiled. "You worry too much." "It's my nature," she said. "And mine to ignore good advice," he replied. She couldn't help it. She laughed softly. The sound broke the stillness in a way that felt almost sinful. When she finally met his eyes, something unspoken flickered there. Part admiration, part longing, and something darker still. It frightened her, yet she could not turn away. He rose from the armchair and walked to her side. For a moment, neither spoke. The fire cracked faintly, the only witness to their proximity. His hand hovered near her shoulder, uncertain, trembling with restraint. Then, a sharp knock at the door. They jumped apart instantly. It was Bert, the servant, carrying a tray. "Shall I bring more coal, ma'am?" he asked, his tone too casual to be innocent. Marianne found her voice. "No, that won't be necessary, Bert. We were just going to retire." Bert's eyes flicked briefly toward Richard before he nodded and left, closing the door behind him. The silence that followed was unbearable. Richard spoke first. "He suspects something." "Then give him no reason to," she said, almost pleading. "Richard, this cannot go on." "What cannot?" he asked quietly. "Friendship? Conversation? Or the way I feel when I look at you?" Her breath caught. "You must stop." "I can't," he said simply. "And neither can you." Marianne's composure broke. "You're my daughter's husband." "And you're my mother's age," he replied. "But none of that matters when I see you." She turned away, trembling. "It matters more than you understand." Richard moved closer, his voice soft but steady. "Then tell me to go. Truly tell me and I'll leave. Say the word." But she couldn't. The words lodged in her throat, strangled by the ache in her chest. He waited a long moment, then gently brushed his fingers against her sleeve. "You see," he whispered. "You can't." Then, with the faintest touch, he lifted her hand to his lips, not a kiss of passion but of promise, of something terribly human and terribly doomed. When he released it, Marianne was shaking. "Go," she managed at last. "Please go." He obeyed, though his eyes lingered on her as he left the room. The door closed behind him with the softest click. Hours later, long after the house had gone still, Marianne stood at her bedroom window. The moon hung pale above the gardens, and the roses below gleamed like drops of blood in the silvery light. She could hear Alice's faint laughter through the wall, her daughter speaking in her sleep, perhaps dreaming of her husband. The thought twisted like a knife. Marianne pressed her palms to her face, choking back a sob. What had she done? What madness had she allowed to root itself in her heart? Downstairs, in the servants' quarters, Bert sat cleaning a brass candlestick. He paused when he heard footsteps above, slow, measured, almost secretive. He looked up toward the ceiling with a frown. "Strange hour for anyone to be walking," he muttered. Little did he know, those midnight footsteps marked the point of no return. The sound of guilt taking its first quiet breath in Ashworth House. Spring slid quietly into the Surrey countryside. The lawns of Ashworth House glistened with dew, daffodils bowed beneath morning rain, and the great oaks whispered as if carrying confessions. To the villagers, nothing seemed changed. Within the house, everything had. Marianne Hale had begun to write. Not to anyone in particular, at least not officially. Her letters were folded pieces of shame, written late at night by candlelight, poured out in a tremulous hand that spoke what her lips dared not. She called them her evening prayers, though every line reeked of longing. "When you touch me, I forget the world. But when you are gone, I remember I am someone's wife and someone's mother. I wish I could forget that too." She never intended them to be sent. Yet, one afternoon, when she left her writing desk unattended, the wind through the open window scattered them to the floor. Richard Hale, passing the doorway, noticed a page drifting near his foot. He picked it up and read. When Marianne returned, he was standing there, the paper trembling in his hand. "You shouldn't," she whispered, frozen. He looked at her, eyes dark with something between awe and pity. "You wrote this. About me." "I wrote it to silence myself," she said faintly. "Not to invite you further." He crossed the room, voice low. "Then burn them, Marianne, or I'll never stop thinking you meant every word." Her pulse fluttered. "Perhaps I do." That admission, soft, reckless, was all it took. He kissed her. The first real kiss, long and ruinous, full of everything unspoken between them. Outside, rain lashed against the window. Inside, the fire consumed the quiet they once called safety. The affair that followed was hidden in the folds of domestic life. A glance across the breakfast table. A brush of fingers as tea was poured, an excuse to visit the cellar or the library when the house slept. Marianne lived in constant fear of discovery, and yet, for the first time in years, she felt alive. Alice noticed small things, her husband's sudden fondness for gardening lessons with her mother, the way he lingered after supper. "You and Mother are becoming quite the companions," she said one morning, half smiling. Richard only replied, "Your mother is wise company." Marianne's spoon slipped from her hand. The clatter echoed longer than it should have. That evening, the wind howled through the chimneys, and Patrick Whitmore worked late in his study. Marianne sat by the drawing-room hearth, staring into the flames. The bundle of letters lay on her lap. Each page seemed alive, breathing guilt. When Richard entered quietly behind her, she didn't turn. "They'll destroy us," she said. "Then destroy them first," he answered, kneeling beside her. "Before someone else does." She hesitated, fingers trembling. "It feels like killing something alive." "Sometimes mercy looks like murder," he said, gently, taking the papers. Together they fed them to the fire. The pages curled and blackened, the ink bleeding into orange light until nothing remained but ashes and the faint scent of burnt wax. Marianne stared, tears stinging her eyes. "It's done," he whispered. "No," she murmured. "It's begun." In the following days, a strange tension gripped the house. Bert, the servant, noticed that the hearth was often relit in rooms where no one sat. He once found half-burnt parchment among the ashes and carried the fragments to Colonel Whitmore, thinking little of it. The old man frowned but said nothing. Still, a seed of curiosity had been sown. Patrick, meanwhile, had grown more irritable, suspecting business troubles but sensing deeper unrest. He watched his wife with renewed scrutiny, though she met his gaze with practiced calm. Only Richard appeared unbothered, too unbothered. One afternoon, while Patrick napped in his chair, Richard found Marianne in the conservatory. She stood among the orchids, light spilling across her face. "He's beginning to wonder," she said quietly, "about everything." "Then let him," Richard replied. "Let the world wonder. I'm tired of hiding." "You don't know what you're saying," she whispered. "Secrets protect us." He caught her wrist. "Secrets destroy us." She pulled free, breath shaking. "You're young. You think love is enough to live on. It isn't. It never is." He stared at her for a long moment, then walked out, the door slamming behind him. For the rest of that day, Marianne sat alone among the flowers, her tears falling onto the soil like rain. By dusk, she realized what terrified her most, not discovery, but losing him. She would rather burn in shame than freeze in his absence. That night, Patrick came to bed early. The lamplight fell across his weathered face as he said, almost kindly, "You've been pale of late, Marianne. Perhaps too much time indoors. You should rest." She turned away, murmuring, "Yes, dear." He placed a hand on her shoulder, gentle, unfamiliar, and for a moment she wanted to confess everything. But when she opened her mouth, the words turned to smoke in her throat. Instead, she whispered, "Good night." When the light went out, she lay awake, listening to his breathing. In the corridor beyond the door, faint footsteps paused, then retreated. She knew them instantly. Richard. And though she dared not move, the ghost of his kiss still burned upon her lips, mingling with the scent of ashes that clung to her hands. The annual spring fete in the village of Ashworth-on-Surrey was a cheerful affair. Bunting fluttering across the green, children chasing ribbons, and the air thick with the scent of fried sweets and tulips. Every year the Whitmores were expected to appear gracious and smiling as the family of standing and respectability. This year Marianne dreaded it. She stood before her dressing mirror, adjusting her pale blue hat, hands trembling. Richard Hale would be there too, of course, assisting with the stalls as the charming son-in-law everyone adored. But beneath the polite chatter and teacups their eyes would meet, and she feared what others might see reflected between them. When she descended the staircase, Patrick Whitmore was already waiting by the door, immaculate in his tweed coat, pipe in hand. "You look well, my dear," he said, in his measured tone. "Perhaps a little rest has done you good." Marianne smiled faintly. "Perhaps." Alice, radiant in yellow, joined them, looping her arm through Richard's. "We'll all go together, won't we? Like old times?" Marianne's gaze flicked to their linked hands. Of course. The fete was alive with music and laughter when they arrived. Miss Ellery from the vicarage ran the bookstall. The colonel judged the flower arrangements. Children squealed as they tossed hoops at painted bottles. Marianne helped at the charity table, arranging rose bouquets. It was supposed to be harmless, except that Richard's stall, the one for the parish raffle, stood directly opposite hers. Between them, a narrow lane of trampled grass became a dangerous line. "Beautiful roses," he murmured as he passed, his tone low enough that only she could hear. "They suit you." "Stop," she whispered without looking up. "I only said the truth," he replied, moving on, but the ghost of his voice lingered like perfume. A young maid from another household noticed the glance and smirked behind her hand. Later, Marianne heard two women whispering near the lemonade stand. "She's too fond of her son-in-law, that Mrs. Hale. You can tell by the way he looks at her. Shame, really, such a fine family." The words struck her like a blow. Her cheeks flushed, the petals in her hands crumpled. When she turned, Patrick was watching her from across the lawn. His eyes narrowed, unreadable. For a heartbeat, she thought he had heard. Then he lifted his pipe and nodded politely to an acquaintance. But the look stayed with her, sharp as glass. That evening, the family gathered for supper. Alice chattered gaily about the fête, recounting who had won the raffles and how Father Ellery had slipped on the wet grass. Richard played the perfect husband, attentive, amused, ordinary. Marianne could scarcely swallow her food. At last Patrick spoke, too casually. "Quite a successful event, though there's talk, of course." "Talk?" Alice frowned. "What about?" "Oh, the usual," he said. "People invent foolish things when they're bored." His gaze shifted toward Marianne, and her hand froze on the tablecloth. "I don't care for gossip," she said quietly. "Nor do I," he replied. "But sometimes, Marianne, silence invites it." The words were mild, but their edge was unmistakable. She excused herself soon after, claiming a headache. Later that night, rain began again. Steady, rhythmic. Marianne stood by the window, staring into the darkness. Across the courtyard, she saw a faint light in the guest room where Richard sometimes worked late. A shadow moved against the curtain. His shadow. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the corridor. The house was silent, but for the ticking clock and the distant drip of rain from the eaves, her feet seemed to move of their own will, carrying her to the door. She knocked softly once. It opened almost at once. He stood there, eyes weary but warm. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "Neither should you," she said, stepping inside. For a few moments neither spoke. The tension that had followed them all day now hung in the air, close enough to touch. "They're beginning to talk," she said at last. "Patrick suspects." "I don't care," Richard murmured. "Let them." "You must," she pleaded. "If he finds out—" He caught her hand. "I'd rather face his wrath than lose you." Her breath trembled. "Richard, please." He kissed her then, a desperate, defiant kiss that tasted of rain and fear. Somewhere below, a door creaked in the wind. The moment broke. She pulled away, eyes glistening. "This will end badly," she whispered. "It already has," he said softly. Outside, thunder rolled across the Surrey hills, as if echoing the truth of it. The night that changed everything began quietly. Rain had stopped by evening, leaving Ashworth House shrouded in mist. A fire burned low in the parlour. Its light flickered against the portraits of ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to watch in judgment. Marianne sat alone, fingers twisting a handkerchief. Every creak of the floorboard made her start. Patrick had retired early after supper, silent and withdrawn. Alice had gone to her room with a book. But Richard had not appeared at all. She waited. Part of her prayed he would come, part of her prayed he wouldn't. At last, footsteps echoed faintly in the corridor. The door opened and closed. He stood there, rain still clinging to his coat, eyes shadowed. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. "I had to," he said. "You've avoided me for days." She rose, trembling. "It's over, Richard. We've gone too far." He moved closer. "You don't mean that." "I do. People are talking. Patrick suspects. I can't live like this." His voice turned bitter. "So this is it? You use me to fill your loneliness and now cast me aside?" Her face flinched as if struck. "Don't cheapen it. You know it was never that." "Then what was it?" he demanded. "Love or pity?" "Something that should never have happened," she said, her voice breaking. "We must end it before more is destroyed." "Too late," he murmured. "It's already destroyed." She turned away, tears glistening. "Please go." He hesitated, jaw tight, then strode out, the door slamming behind him. Marianne sank into the chair, shaking. The air in the room felt thin, suffocating. She pressed a hand to her chest. "God, what have I done?" An hour later, raised voices broke the stillness of the house. Patrick's voice, hard, furious, echoed from the staircase. "You think I don't see it? The whispers, the looks? You've shamed this family, Marianne." "I have done nothing," she cried, descending the steps, pale and terrified. "Liar," he bellowed. "I saw you, Paul, in his room, at this hour. My daughter's husband." "It isn't what you think. It's exactly what I think," he thundered, stepping closer. "You've ruined us all." She backed against the banister. "Patrick, please." "You disgust me," he said through clenched teeth. "You and that boy will both answer for this." Something in her snapped. "Then perhaps you should ask yourself why I looked elsewhere for warmth," she cried. "You left me years ago, cold and unseen. What right have you to speak of shame?" His hand rose in rage. But in that instant, the candle on the table tipped, wax spilling across the floor. Patrick stepped back, losing his footing. There was a cry, a heavy thud, and silence. Marianne froze. At the bottom of the staircase lay her husband, motionless. The candle flickered beside him, its flame guttering in the draught. "Patrick," she whispered, kneeling beside him. No answer. His eyes stared past her, wide and empty. A tremor passed through her whole body. She reached for his hand, but it was already cold. Then footsteps. Light, hurried, and Alice appeared, a shawl clutched around her shoulders. "Mother? What happened?" Marianne looked up, her voice barely a breath. "He fell. I tried to stop him." Alice gasped, covering her mouth, and turned toward the stairs. "Richard! Richard! Come quickly!" When he arrived, his face went white. He knelt beside Patrick, checking for a pulse, but found none. Then his gaze lifted to Marianne's tear-streaked face, and what he saw there told him everything. He whispered, "Oh God, what have you done?" Marianne pressed a trembling hand to her lips. "I didn't mean to. I swear I didn't mean to." Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the windows. In its howl, it carried the sound of a single woman's sob, and the beginning of a lie that would soon destroy them all. The morning after the fall dawned pale and cold. A thin mist clung to the gardens of Ashworth House, softening the outline of its chimneys and turning the rose beds into grey ghosts. Inside, the air was heavy with mourning and the sharp scent of extinguished candles. Patrick Whitmore was dead. The coroner called it an accident, a misstep on the staircase, a tragic fall. Everyone in the village accepted the verdict at once. After all, Patrick was aging, his health uncertain, and the stairs steep. But within the house, the silence was unnatural. Grief had too many shapes. and none of them seemed honest. Alice wept quietly in her room, her innocence shattered. Richard played the dutiful husband, tending to her with gentle words and sleepless eyes. Yet every time he looked at Marianne, his expression darkened, a mixture of pity, anger, and fear. Marianne herself moved like a ghost through the corridors. Her black gown rustled softly, her face pale, her voice reduced to whispers. She answered condolences with mechanical politeness, but inside, her heart was a storm. Every tick of the clock sounded like accusation. It was on the third day during the condolence calls that Miss Clara Ellery arrived, a neighbour from the vicarage, known for her kindness and her unsettling sharpness of mind. She came with flowers and gentle words, but her eyes missed nothing. "I was terribly fond of Patrick," she said softly. "He was a man of principle, if not of warmth." Marianne tried to smile. "He will be remembered kindly." Miss Ellery's gaze drifted to the hearth, where a faint trace of ash lingered despite the servants' cleaning. "Strange, isn't it, how ashes remain even after a fire dies?" she murmured. "Some things refuse to vanish entirely." Marianne stiffened. "I beg your pardon?" "Oh, nothing," said Miss Ellery with a polite smile. "I merely find it comforting, the way traces stay reminding us of what once burned." She left soon after, leaving the scent of violets in the air and a single, gnawing unease in Marianne's chest. That evening, Inspector Graham came to complete his formalities. A courteous man with steady eyes, he asked simple questions. The time of the fall, who was present, what candlelight remained. It all seemed routine, yet his manner was deliberate, as though weighing words. "You say Mr. Whitmore tripped on the top stair?" he asked. "Yes," Marianne answered quietly. "He was angry. We argued, nothing serious, and he turned too quickly." "Angry, you say? About what, if I may?" "Household matters," she said quickly, eyes fixed on her hands. Richard, standing behind her, spoke up. "My father-in-law had been short-tempered of late. Mother tried to calm him." The inspector nodded slowly. "And you were where, Mr. Hale?" "In my study. I heard the fall." Graham studied him for a moment longer, then turned back to Marianne. "Forgive me, ma'am, but I notice bruising on your wrist. Did that occur during the fall?" She flinched. I don't recall. Perhaps when I reached for him." He made a small note in his book. "I see. Well, a terrible accident indeed. I'll trouble you no further." When he left, the house sank once more into silence. But Marianne could feel the eyes of the living and the dead upon her. The inspector's calm gaze, Richard's cold restraint, and the echo of Patrick's final breath. That night, she sat alone by the drawing-room fire. The flames licked faintly at the logs, throwing shadows on the walls. She reached for the poker, stirring the embers, and watched a faint spark glow and die. In the ashes, she thought she saw the shape of a letter, edges curled, half-burnt words faintly visible. "It's begun." Her breath caught. She pressed a hand to her mouth. It couldn't be. The letters had all burned, hadn't they? A gust of wind rattled the window panes, scattering ash across the rug. Marianne rose abruptly, heart pounding. Upstairs, a door creaked open. She froze, staring into the dark. Perhaps it was only the wind, or perhaps the past was not done burning after all. A week had passed since Patrick Whitmore's death, yet Ashworth House remained steeped in unease. The morning curtains were still drawn, the clocks muffled, and the servants moved as though afraid to disturb ghosts. For most, grief fades gently into habit. But for Marianne Hale, it sharpened into fear. Each night she woke to the same echo, Patrick's voice, rising in fury, followed by the thud of his fall. Each morning she forced herself to smile for Alice, to meet Richard's gaze without trembling. But even silence had weight, and it pressed harder with every passing hour. It was Miss Clara Ellery who broke that silence. She arrived one grey afternoon, carrying a basket of flowers and the gentle authority of a woman used to being underestimated. "Forgive my intrusion," she said kindly. "I thought some fresh blooms might cheer the drawing room." Marianne managed a faint smile. "That's very thoughtful of you, Miss Ellery." "Oh, not at all," the woman replied, setting the flowers by the hearth. "I've always believed that even the darkest rooms deserve light." Her eyes, sharp and blue, flicked toward the fire grate. "I see you've been burning quite a lot lately." Marianne's throat tightened. "It's cold these evenings." "Indeed, though I wonder—" Miss Ellery bent slightly, stirring the ashes with the poker. A faint scrap of paper clung to the iron tip. She examined it delicately, reading what remained. "Never meant to hurt you." "How curious," she said softly. "Ashes do like to tell stories." Marianne snatched the poker from her hand. "That's nothing, just rubbish. Old letters I wish to forget." "Of course." Miss Ellery straightened, her smile as gentle as before. "But forgetting is never as easy as burning, is it?" That evening, Inspector Graham returned. His visit was brief but unsettling. He had re-examined the staircase and found a candle holder dented near the banister. "Strange," he remarked to Richard in the study. "The fall was said to be simple, but this suggests a struggle. Perhaps Mr. Whitmore stumbled while reaching for someone." Richard's hands tightened around the edge of the desk. "You mean someone might have been there?" The inspector studied him. "Perhaps. You wouldn't happen to know who, would you?" Richard hesitated. "My mother-in-law and he argued." She tried to calm him. "Ah," Graham murmured. "So she was near him?" When the inspector left, Richard poured himself a drink with shaking hands. The truth was closing in thread by thread, and he could feel the noose tightening, not only around Marianne, but around them both. Later that night, Richard found Marianne in the parlour, sitting rigid before the dying fire. "He knows," she whispered. "I saw it in his eyes. He'll find everything." "He has no proof," Richard said, "unless you give him one." Her eyes filled with tears. "I already have. That letter scrap, Miss Ellery found it. I thought they were all gone." He turned away, pacing. "We should leave. Tonight, if we must." "And what then?" she asked bitterly. "Run away like lovers from a cheap novel?" "I'm a widow, Richard. You're my daughter's husband. There is no we anymore." "Don't say that," he begged. She rose, trembling. "I will, because it's the only way left to save what little decency remains." He stared at her, his expression breaking. "You think they'll ever let you forget? They'll whisper till your dying breath." "I can live with whispers," she said softly. "I can't live with murder." The words hung between them, heavier than the silence that followed. Outside, a storm was gathering. Low thunder rolling over the hills, wind hissing through the garden like a warning. And as lightning flared against the windows, Miss Ellery watched from the lane below, her eyes bright and knowing. Something wicked lay beneath Ashworth House, and by morning she intended to bring it to light. Dawn broke over Ashworth House like a hesitant sigh. Pale light touched the ivy-clad walls and spilled through the long windows of the drawing room, where the fire from the night before had gone cold. The air smelled faintly of smoke and guilt. Miss Clara Ellery arrived early, a calm figure in a grey coat. She was met by Inspector Graham, who had already spent the morning walking the grounds. He removed his hat politely. "Good morning, Miss Ellery. You said you had something important." I believe, she said quietly, that the tragedy in this house is no accident. And I think the truth lies in what was left behind and what was burned. Graham followed her into the parlour. The hearth still held traces of ash. She knelt, sifting through it with a gloved hand. I found this last night, she said, holding out a small gold locket, blackened at the edges. Inside is a fragment of paper, the same hand as the note I showed you before. The inspector studied it. A single line remained legible. If you love me, say nothing. They exchanged a look. Then, without a word, Graham called for Marianne. When Marianne Hale entered the room, she seemed smaller than ever. A woman drained of all colour, her black dress too heavy for her frail shoulders. Her hands trembled as she folded them before her. Mrs. Hale, Graham said gently, I'm afraid we must trouble you again. You told me your husband's fall was an accident, but certain things suggest otherwise. The bruises on your wrist, the dented candlestick, and now this. He placed the locket on the table. For a long moment Marianne stared at it. Then slowly she sank into the nearest chair. Where did you find it? In the ashes, Miss Ellery said softly. Marianne's lips parted in a soundless gasp. Her eyes filled with tears. Then it seems nothing truly burns away, does it? Graham said nothing. The silence stretched like a taut wire. At last, she whispered, Yes, I was there. We argued. He struck me. I tried to stop him, and he fell. I swear it was an accident. And the locket? Asked Miss Ellery. Her voice shook. It was mine. Inside was a letter from Richard. Foolish, sentimental things. I tried to destroy them all after Patrick died. I thought if the fire took them, so would the sin. Graham nodded gravely. And Mr. Hale, your son-in-law, knew of this letter? Her silence was answer enough. At that moment, Richard himself entered, pale and dishevelled. You're not questioning her alone, are you? He demanded. She's unwell. Leave her be. Graham's gaze hardened. On the contrary, Mr. Hale, I believe you may hold the missing piece of this unhappy puzzle. Richard's voice trembled. You think I think, Miss Ellery interrupted quietly, that love can bind two people together, or burn them both alive. Which has it been for you, Mr. Hale? Richard looked at Marianne, her tear-streaked face, her trembling hands. The weight of what they had done hung between them like smoke. She wanted to end it, he said at last. I couldn't let her. I followed her that night, heard them arguing. When he fell, I panicked. I helped her move the candlestick, cleaned the floor, told her to stay silent. I thought I was saving her. Marianne gave a soft, broken cry. You saved nothing, she whispered. Only doomed us both. Graham sighed, closing his notebook. The law will decide whose hand caused the fall, but guilt, I think, has already passed judgment. That evening, the house was quiet again. Rain began to fall, soft and steady. Marianne sat alone before the fire, the same hearth where she had once burned her letters, believing she could erase love as one erases ink. On the table lay a small envelope addressed to Miss Ellery. Its single line read, "Forgive me, love should never have survived the fire." When the servants entered hours later, they found the hearth roaring again, flames leaping wildly. Marianne was seated in her chair, motionless, her hands folded peacefully in her lap, her face serene. The firelight danced around her like a crown. The doctors would call it an accident, perhaps a fainting spell too close to the flames. But Miss Ellery, standing in the rain outside, understood better. The widow had chosen her own kind of absolution, one final act of confession. As the fire died and dawn touched the sky once more, the last of the roses outside began to bloom, crimson against the grey.